Okay, hi everyone. I'm David, and I'm a sophomore in ECE. And today I will talk about a very exciting JavaScript library that you can use to build websites and applications, and it's called React. So before we actually use React, why are we using React, and what is it? So React is a JavaScript library, and it was created by Facebook. I also like to emphasize that React is not a language. The language that we're using is JavaScript, and it was released in 2013 to the public as an open source project. And what that means is anyone can contribute to the code, can view the code, suggest features and bug fixes. In addition, React runs on Node.js and renders in the browser. So if you attended the last talk, you know that Node.js is a JavaScript engine that allows you to run JavaScript code outside of the web browser. Basically, what this does is Node.js acts as our web server. It compiles the wait, sorry. It compiles um, the code in JavaScript into HTML, which is rendered in your web browser. So why should we use React? There are four main reasons why we want to use React over plain HTML or even other web frameworks. First of all, it is declarative. So as compared to imperative programming, which describes how to run a program, declarative programming focuses on what the program should have. The compiler handles how this program is converted from like code in JavaScript into HTML. So we don't actually have to describe all of the steps for that to be converted into HTML. Second, it's also modular. So React is designed to be broken down into components. Pages are created by putting these components together. This makes it very simple for us to make very complex pages. So especially pages that have at least 5 different parts that are displaying different information. What we can do is just make different components for all of them, and then reference them in when we create the page layout. Third, it is stateful. So this means that React can record interactions made by the user and change what's on the site based on this data. This is part of the world's shift towards different type of websites. So as compared to before, where we had static websites, which was composed only of HTML, CSS, and some simple JavaScript. Today, the world's websites are powered by data. So a lot of the information you can see on websites can be found in a database, and this data is massive. So you have things like uh, like news websites, which can collect data from like a back end, and it shows it as an article in the front. Wait, sorry, like, something's weird with PowerPoint today. Um, it's also cross-platform, so React can record. Wait, sorry. It's cross-platform, so it's so for the web we will be looking at React.js, and um, there's also React Native, which allows you to make mobile apps with the same syntax as React.js. But we'll only be looking at React.js for today. So these are some apps and websites that use React, from social media platforms like Facebook, which created React, to news platforms like CNN, and even language learning platforms like Duolingo. All of these use React in their own way. Uh, if you'd like to identify some of these in the chat, you can do so. Actually, I'm just gonna check what's wrong with PowerPoint. This will just take a minute. Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. Everything's fixed now. So I think there was just leftover stuff from when I was building there were like timings embedded. So yes. Um, so Now some things to take note of. When we're building React, there are many versions of React. There are also multiple ways to write code for React. For this talk and for the lab later, we will only be using React version 16, which is the latest version of React. And also we will be using functional components. I would like to emphasize that older versions of React have other ways of creating components. So like if you see anything like class components, that is a different way of creating components, but it's exactly the same thing as a functional component. It's just stated in a different manner. But right now, the maintainers of React recommend that you use the new style, which is functional components, and that's what we'll be learning right here. Before we can look at exactly how we can make code for React, we should understand this core concept of the virtual DOM. And if you're not familiar with a DOM, DOM is a document object model. It's basically a tree structure that defines how a website is laid out. Usually, if you look at like HTML, like let's say this right side here, this DOM actually has its root at like the HTML tag, and each child tag is another branch in the tree structure. But in React, we don't use this real DOM structure because it's quite complicated. When you start dealing with websites with lots of components, you don't want to have every single tag as or like represented in the tree structure, because that gets very difficult to look at. So instead, what we do is we have this virtual DOM, and this virtual DOM has components. So we have component 1, 2, and 3. Each component has inside its own attributes. So for example, we have state properties and events, and each of these are separate from each other. So each component has its own intrinsic values, and it cannot be read from another one unless we explicitly state it could. And also note that these components can be nested inside each other, like HTML tags. It's also cool because as once you're done compiling like the React code, it's actually converted into HTML. So this JavaScript code actually gets inserted back into the real DOM. And we don't need to look at how that works. It's just, we just have to define it how we want it to be in the component structure, and it will automatically convert for you. So now to a basic example. What exactly does React look like? So this is JSX, and JSX stands for JavaScript with XML. It's sort of like HTML with JavaScript, and it lets us define some components and use those components as if they were HTML tags. So if you look at this example right here, we have one component called welcome, and welcome is actually a function. So if you like think about it a bit more, it makes it easier for us to define a specific behavior to specific parts of our website. If we know how to write that part as a function in JavaScript, then it should be completely simple. If you look here at the bottom, this is actually what renders that component. So you don't have to understand like exactly how it's rendered, but know that this component welcome is rendered is rendered here in this function. And we will look at how to build this component from scratch step by step. So when we create components, we start with the function declaration. So if you look here, we just define a function called welcome, and you have to take note that every function has the same, like every component function has the same name as the component. So if you say the function name is welcome, then the component will be called welcome. Similarly, we also have the JSX tag here at the bottom. And so the JSX tag, like HTML, has two parts. So the tag name here, which is welcome, and the second part, which is the tag attributes. The tag attributes are like, for example, if you want to put name equals WDW 2020, this actually gets passed into the function as an argument. And how does this happen? So in a component, a functional component can take an argument called props. And props is like short for properties. Basically, props is an object that contains a lot of information about this component that we have right here. So if you want to access this name value, you can actually use props.name, and the value of this will be exactly the same as what we inputted here in the JSX tag. Now, what if we want to make it look different? So when we actually create components, we can return the output behavior of the components as HTML or JSX. And it's as simple as just doing a return statement inside our component. In fact, every single component must have a return statement, because if you do not have a return statement, React doesn't know how to render that component. So since it's a JSX expression, we can actually either write it as a one-line HTML string, not string, HTML code, like piece of code, or if you have multiple lines, you can wrap them around with parentheses. And basically what this function does is that it returns an h1 tag with this value here. And what is this value? So in JSX, we have this interesting property where we can actually embed JavaScript inside our JSX expression. So if you look here, we have these curly braces, and it's always denoted by curly braces. Inside this curly brace, we can just reference the value of we can reference the variable that we want to insert in the h1 tag. Additionally, you can also call functions inside these. Just some note, like just a note. There are some things you cannot embed inside a JSX expression. For example, you cannot embed if and else statements. So just take note of that. What about more frequent changes? Because what we just described was how to make something static. Whenever we call it, it always shows that same thing. But what if we want to have like a click counter? Let's say on our website, we have a button, and when we click the button, it changes text on another component. And then in addition to that, it changes the title bar of the document, of the website. So how do we do that? Before we can dive into how that works, we have to talk about some other concepts that React has. So two of them are state and lifecycle. So state variables, unlike props, which are immutable. So state variables are immutable. And if you think about it, why is props immutable? So if we go back to the function we have here, actually this one, if we go back to the function we have here, we define props as the argument that is passed in when we call this function. Basically when we write the tag here. And so usually the tag does not change when you're calling the function. So every time you look at this tag, it's like you're calling the function once. And if you have sort of like some experience with programming, you don't usually change what you insert in the function as arguments. So this is even though you can change like the value of something in the props, it is not intended behavior. Like that is not what we're supposed to do, but it is possible. Similarly, actually conversely, state variables are meant to be changed. So if we think about like how React actually renders the website to HTML, basically what happens is it takes all of the components and then it renders it once when you load the page, right? What if we change something in the page? So it re-renders the page, and every time it re-renders, it actually redeclares all of the variables again, and reassigns all the variables to their initial values. So we can't actually keep any local variables the same. We can't change them over different renders. So how do we do this? We actually have state variables, and state variables are they have persistent state. So every time, let's say like we render it once and we assign a state variable to a certain value. If we change the state variable, on one render, or on like on one of the renders, it will actually re-render, and the value of the state variable will remain the same. So it won't reset it back to the original value. And now all of this talk about render and re-renders, how does this even happen? So whenever props or state of a component changes, React actually triggers a render, like a re-render of the component, just so that it can see all of those changes. And we can actually use what's called a lifecycle method. So lifecycle method are functions that are called whenever we see a change in the value of a specific or all state variables. It usually happens when the component renders or mounts for the first time. We have to be mindful though, when we do these lifecycle methods, that we can hit like infinite loops. So let's say our lifecycle method is used to check if, let's say, the state is changed. What if we set the state inside the lifecycle method? So what ends up happening is React loads the state for the first time. The lifecycle method sees that we loaded the state, so it will change the state to something else. And since it changed the state, React will reload the component again, and then it will keep running until like the computer like dies. So we don't want to do stuff like that, and we have to be mindful of what we put inside our lifecycle method. And now onto events. So if you remember right here in your virtual DOM, we have state props and events. So events are basically like whenever you perform a specific action. So two examples of those are click and submit. Whenever you perform a specific action, you can actually assign a specified behavior to that action. So let's say we have a button, and every time we click the button, we want some function to run. We can actually use this onClick event. And so this acts as an event handler, and it triggers the function call whenever you click that component. It doesn't have to be a button though. It can even be a div or a text, a piece of text that when you click it, it changes something. There's also onSubmit, which is similar to onClick, but it's when you submit the form, that's when it gets called. And I think there's also onChange. So if you have inputs, you can do something if you change the input. And now we have all of the three parts of the component. So there's state, props, and events. And those are basically the core concepts you need to know before you can start building a React app. How do we start building this app though? Usually people don't build React from scratch. That's quite difficult because it requires a lot of setup. And so the developers of React actually created this really nice tool called Create React App. And when you want to create your own React app, you can just run these commands. So npx is basically a way for you to execute a node module without actually installing it. So we run this. If you have node installed, you can just run this command, and it actually creates your entire directory for you. And that is it for the React talk. If you have any questions, please put them down in chat. For actually building the app though, we will have a lab. So I think it will also be, it's in the website, but it can be pasted in the chat. Yeah, so I'll be looking at questions right now if anyone has them. Okay, while people are asking questions, I'll just show you an example of what we're gonna do in the lab. So this is a simple app that I made in a few hours. Actually, it was like an hour. This thing actually uses the dining API, which if you joined the last talk, you just made a very simple version of that. And what this does is every time you reload the page, it actually checks which dining locations are open, and it lists them in this format. Oh, wait, sorry. I'll just start the React app. Yeah, so every time you reload the page, it actually like puts all of the dining locations down. And there is this really cool tool that you have in Google Chrome, or if you're using Firefox, it also has that. If you download the extension, there is a React Dev tool. So I can actually see all of the components that I used in this React app there. And if you look at these, all of these are actually components nested inside different components, like how I described in the DOM structure. In addition, you can also look at the profiler, which shows you how different components are re-rendered or rendered. And so let's say I stop profiling. See, these components render sequentially, and um, whenever something is called like a component, a larger component actually renders the smaller components after like the large component is rendered, and something like that. But more of that in the lab. So if you have a lot of time, actually, it shouldn't take too long. You can check out the lab.
Thank you, David.